Brian is a former award-winning national security reporter and editor and strategic communications executive who advises clean energy, space, and biotech companies, nonprofits, and research universities for strategic marketing innovations of Washington, D.C. government affairs firm. Brian was one of the first reporters to cover the existence of ATIP, the Pentagon's secretive UAP study. He also broke the news on many congressional UAP briefings and other policy initiatives related to the government's interest in UAP studies. Hopefully, yep, we've got that video going. So you're all set. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Alejandro, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Glad to be here. I always begin my talks with sort of a disclaimer, or a couple of disclaimers, I guess. Number one, I always like to remind people that I am not a ufologist. And for this crowd, I should also probably make clear that I'm not a scientist. But I did spend about 25 years as a national security reporter covering the Pentagon, other national security agencies, spent a lot of time in the field covering the US military, the Congress, and a good bit of US foreign policy. And I think it's always helpful when I'm talking about sort of what I've seen and how I've seen the UAP issue evolve in recent years to kind of start really at the beginning for me. And as I mentioned, I was a reporter for a long time covering national security, and I really don't remember an instance where UFOs, or what we now call UAP, ever came up. And looking back, I feel like that's kind of hard to believe. But I think, the stigma, the sort of marginalization of the issue was so strong that it just never really entered the kind of officialdom ecosystem of what you talked about and what was acceptable discourse. I think the only time that maybe it came up to a certain extent was when we were talking about or covering or asking questions about what we called the black budget, the classified budget at the Pentagon, which, of course, as many of you know, involves a lot of very secret aerospace development programs. And, if there was ever a time where, people might raise the issue of, what do they got in those secret programs? What are they building? What kind of technological breakthroughs do they have? That's really the only time where the issue might come up. But even then, it was very tangential and it was not really a direct discussion. That changes in a big way in 2017, the summer of 2017, really, when Politico, where I was a national security reporter at the time, the New York Times, of course, and a couple of other major media outlets were all sort of chasing the same story, or we're also, better way to put it, we're all being pitched on the same story, which was that a government official named Luis Elizondo, we all know his name, was overseeing the UFO portfolio at the Pentagon and was frustrated and was about to leave government and wanted to come forward publicly with his concerns that the leadership of the Department of Defense, in his case, was not paying enough attention, was not taking seriously enough some very interesting and inexplicable sightings of craft, particularly around military installations. And of course, when the story was pitched to me, I was quite wary at first. Number one, the fact that, apparently the Pentagon had a UFO research effort, although by 2017, the official program, we all know it as ATIP, was actually defunct at that point for about, I guess, 5 or 6 years. But the way we understood it was the topic was still a topic of interest, at least for a few select people in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and Lou Elizondo was one of those. So it's December 2017 that Politico, the New York Times, somewhat coincidentally on the same day, published our stories about Mr. Elizondo's concerns, but also the fact that Congress quietly had set up a relatively small research effort that came to be known as ATIP to look into a series of these sightings, particularly those reported by military pilots. And if you had asked me in 2017 to predict where the story would have gone after that, I don't think I would have been able to predict what's happened since. I mean, I've been quite surprised, number one, at the attention that it got and this sort of the traction that the issue got. I think, we need to give credit where credit is due. Whatever you may think of Lou Elizondo, of his views, of his credibility, et cetera, I don't think we'd be here having this conversation, this national conversation about UAP without him. If he had not come forward, it's very hard to see how Politico or the New York Times or others would have been interested in the story. I mean, maybe there would have still been a story about the ATIP program, et cetera. But if you didn't have a person who was kind of the face of it, who was willing to go on the record, willing to go public, I'm not sure that things would have developed the way they have. Secondly, we can't discount the role of particularly Navy aviators who came forward. Several of them, like Ryan Graves, David Fravor, were the ones who testified this past week in Congress. But the testimony of the pilots, I think, added another layer of credibility. And it was really difficult for Congress in particular to just look away and not ask more questions. And so those initial stories in 2017 led to, as Alejandro alluded to, a series of briefings in Congress. And again, this was not Congress, writ large standing up and saying, where the UFOs. It was a select group, but an influential group that sat on some key committees like Armed Services in the Senate and the House, the intelligence committees. But they sort of sunk their teeth into this, wanted to know more, started asking questions, and it kind of really snowballed from there. More pilots came forward, some publicly, but some just behind closed doors, briefing Congress on what they saw. That led to, as I think many of us have been tracking, a series of new laws, legislation that was passed, in a bipartisan way by both houses of Congress and signed both by President Trump and President Biden, that led to a much more formal government effort to collect data on UAP, to presumably share that information or some of that information with Congress and begin a process that I think we can say 5-6 years after those initial stories broke really has kind of gotten an engine of its own. I see this debate continuing. I see Congress continuing to ask questions. It's pretty amazing to think that just this past week, you had a senior intelligence official, David Grush, testify under oath in public, claiming to have knowledge of UFO retrieval programs, efforts to reverse engineer, non-human craft, and then, of course, the claims about biologics, which is sort of a fancy way of saying alien bodies or alien biological material. That's pretty amazing. I mean, I never would have predicted that you would have that kind of conversation. My point of view is I still think there's many, many, many more questions that need to be asked. Obviously, Mr. Grush is the first to say that he's not seen these programs himself or this evidence himself. He's hearing it from what he considers very credible people on the inside. But, the truth is, I titled this chat, how UFOs landed on Washington, because I think they really have. And I would even say they're hovering over Washington. They're not necessarily going away. The issue is not going away. One of the other things I think is important and was one of maybe my big takeaways of this hearing this past week is not just simply do we have more questions, but I think the skeptic in me, and by skeptic I mean journalist who wants to see more objective facts, not theories, not potential explanations, but real data, real information. I think as far as we've come in 6 years in terms of the discussion and the debate and the questions being asked and the laws being written, including to encourage people like David Grush to come forward and feel like they can come forward and not fear for their either professional or even their personal safety. We haven't really learned much new. And many of those here may disagree with me, but I was sort of racking my brain the other day and thinking like, okay, if you go back 6 years, given all that I've said about the testimony of pilots and the congressional action, the establishment of a Pentagon office, AARO as it's now called, to collect and collate and analyze more and more UAP data. The truth is we haven't learned anything really substantially more about what the government might or might not know about the phenomenon. We just simply haven't. We have claims, the most provocative of late, obviously being Mr. Grush's, but we don't have evidence of it. As far as I can tell from my sources, Congress doesn't have evidence of it either. They probably have more information than we, the public, do in terms of where these programs he says he's aware of might exist or did exist. But again, that's going to require a lot of follow-up. So I say that because I caution everyone who gets excited like this is a train that's moving and we're going to get more answers. I'm not convinced that we're any closer to having real new information that we can say, wow, this is what they've known, or this is what we think some of these sightings are, or the explanation for them, et cetera, et cetera. And then my other big takeaway from the hearing was you can't walk away from this testimony and the public statements just this week, but also just in the last couple of years from the Department of Defense, that somebody, if you believe David Grush is right or his sources are right, somebody's lying, because the Pentagon basically refutes on the record what he's claiming. So how do you explain that? How do you reconcile that? Is the Pentagon just blatantly lying that we do have crash retrieval programs and we're just saying that we don't, trying to discredit David Grush? Is David Grush misinformed, which I think is a possibility? I mean, Alejandro, you and I have talked about, the potential for this galactic game of telephone. I mean, I've learned over the years that even people on the inside with very high security clearances, they're human beings too. They're prone to some of the same things that we all are, which is the water cooler talk. Oh, I heard from someone who works on this very secret program, and you're not going to believe what he told me, but they have X, Y, and Z. It's not proof. It's just simply not proof. And just because these people have senior clearances is not enough to take to the bank. We need more information. We need more sources. And ultimately, the congressional oversight committees need to see these programs. If they really do exist, they need to see them. And the last thing I'll say on that, I'm reconciling the sort of the public denials and the very sort of provocative claims that people like David Grush are making. We have to be open to the possibility that both are true. And by that, I mean, we can't assume that the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, as it's called, this Pentagon office established by Congress, knows everything. I mean, if these secret rabbit warren agencies like the CIA and the National Security Agency and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, I mean, the 22 dozen plus alphabet soup intelligence agencies, if they're not sharing everything they might have, hidden and buried in these compartmentalized programs to this so-called, belly button called AARO that is supposed to have everything, then AARO only can tell us what they know and what they have found. And if you look at their statements, they will be very carefully worded. we have not uncovered, we have not gathered any information that would suggest blah, 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 blah. And so I think, I hope that's helpful. I feel like I could throw up a bunch of PowerPoint slides and do a timeline on sort of how we got here, but a lot of smarter people have done that. And maybe, Alejandro, if you're still there, I'd like to leave plenty of time. I don't know how much time I have, but plenty of time for questions and conversation, if that's okay with you. I know in a crowd like this, sometimes that's risky.
Well, I think that you'll find that'll be helpful. We're already getting a lot of questions, and I have a ton of questions for you. So, oh yeah, we're getting a lot of
Because
questions.
I could drone on, but nobody wants to hear me drone on.
So I just want to tackle one thing real quick and go through that list of agencies, because we certainly have a situation where there are some agencies who are being cooperative and some that are not. So for instance, I would love to hear, and of course we've talked a lot, so I know what kind of insight you have, at least on some of these, because we haven't talked about some of the latest ones. But the Navy, the Navy very quickly, after the pilots were on television, on 60 Minutes, on that unidentified television show that Lou and Chris Mellon were on, the Navy very quickly said, we back these guys. Those videos that they shared were real. Those were unidentified cases. We take this very seriously. We believe our fighter pilots. And we're even gonna institute some new protocols around reporting of UAP. But we haven't heard a lot from any of the other agencies, really, not as powerful as that. Why do you feel the Navy jumped in so quickly, despite other groups like the Air Force almost being completely silent this entire time?
It's interesting. I mean, I guess when I think about it, having covered the Navy as a reporter for years, and been out in the fleet, covering like military operations, but also covering how the Navy just interfaces with the media and the public, they've always been much more proactive in terms of their public messaging. There's a lot of jokes around the Pentagon about the differences between the sort of the public affairs arms of the different military branches. And the Navy always, number one, considered public affairs and public messaging and the interaction with the public as key to its mission. In other words, you could always be a public affairs officer in the Navy. That was a dedicated specialty for an officer to be trained and to be promoted into, successively higher positions, effectively as a spokesperson who's in charge of how does the Navy tell its story? How does it interact with the public? How does it, do messaging? Very different from the Army, which for years, a public affairs officer was a secondary specialty. So you were an infantry officer or a tank commander, and you had like a secondary specialty, which was, I'm also the spokesman for the unit. It was seen as sort of a secondary thing. So I only throw that out because I think culture matters in this. The Navy is an institution. My sense is, saw that these pilots were coming forward. They were credible. They were concerned. They were raising safety issues. And I think the Navy, somebody in the Navy in the higher levels probably said, the cat's out of the bag on this. We can't distance ourselves from them. They're our pilots. We train them. They fly off our aircraft carriers. So I think the Navy was sort of probably just came to the conclusion that, this dropped in our lap and we can't ignore it. And, we need to have their backs. And so I think that's why the Navy publicly came out supporting them. I think it was the Navy that was the first to issue some initial guidelines for pilots to report UAP sightings and to feel like, you're not going to be vilified if you go back to the ready room after your flight and bring this up if you saw something that you couldn't explain. So to me, the best explanation of this is probably just culture. The Navy is more attuned to shaping the message, being out in front of it, and not, and to some extent not burying it. It's not as much their culture as it is, I think, some of the other military branches. I imagine you're going to ask me about the Air Force next.
I'm not going to ask you about the Air
No?
Force next because I'm sure that'll come up because the Air Force, DoD, and Susan Goff, obviously a lot of problems in those arenas. But I want to kind of get into the science because I think one of the things that's been mysterious is NASA's role in all of this and how that may look going forward. So, for instance, when you said, in the years, this topic really wasn't in the scope of like officialdom. And really, after the 2017 articles, one of the first times I saw it being brought into that was you. You held this forum for Politico where you had, I think, the NASA panel that President Trump had of advisors, and there were a couple of politicians there that were part of the committee, and you had raised the question, hey, this story just released. What do you guys think? This is interesting. And it was the first time I had first seen the question posed. Second of all, they were very positive about it. And this was related to NASA and space. Now we have this panel that I think many people are looking forward to NASA potentially participating, but they frame themselves as just a panel to put together a report that advises AARO. So, but I think that's a bit confusing. What do you see? What are your predictions as far as NASA's role? And will it go beyond just advising AARO? Are they going to put out their paper and that'll be it? What are your thoughts there?
It's interesting. I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, I think as much as the stigma of discussing this and talking about it and holding hearings about it has ebbed, and it has, you can't lose sight of the fact that if the government does have secrets about this topic, particularly secrets they've kept secret for a long, long time, and even if it's not the big reveal, but let's say they have very interesting puzzle pieces, you have to keep that at the forefront of your mind in trying to understand how do government agencies of various stripes respond to this. And I am one who believes there are puzzle pieces. I don't know what they are. I don't know that I believe, the alien bodies are buried. Roswell was a real thing. There's been a cover up for 75 years and, we're only now getting close to finally learning it. There's not enough objectively available information to lead me to believe that. But I do believe there are secrets that they don't want to talk about. Big question mark on what those are. So if you take that as kind of a first kind of foundation, then I think NASA sees that the Pentagon has made the lead agency for this. Let the Pentagon run it. That's what Congress set up. We can be a supporting player. Because the truth is, in a lot of these government agencies, particularly at the highest levels, this issue is still kryptonite. I mean, nobody wants to be the UFO agency. It's too uncertain. Where does this go? Where does this lead? So I think NASA, as a scientific agency about exploration, I think they probably shrewdly decided, well, we could do a report, pull together a bunch of experts on how we should approach this topic scientifically. How should we study it going forward? That gets them out of the business of having to be transparent about what they know. Because obviously there's a lot of people that think NASA must know some good stuff too. So I don't get the sense that this panel has any sort of marching orders to kind of dig up what does NASA know about this topic so that we can be more transparent either with Congress or the public. It's sort of the easy way out. Come up with a scientific report, give it to AARO because AARO's got the limelight on them and they're the ones in charge. They have to answer the mail. And, we can sort of be in the background. And so, I mean, if I were running NASA, I'd probably do the same thing, right? Or any of us probably would.
Well, if I was running it, I would have a full-fledged program that's well-funded, funding SCU, Project Heslin. But I do want to move on
if you
to
convince the president and the Congress to fund that, yes.
Yeah. Well, we might be getting there. Hopefully we're getting close to that. But some of the troublemakers, so some of, obviously if you're talking about the sky, you're talking about aerial phenomena. You think of the Air Force and you think of the FAA. Like I mentioned, Air Force has kind of been not participating in the conversation whatsoever. FAA has also not been present much. I thought it was very disappointing in the NASA panel where they asked the FAA representative, how do pilots report UAP? And he said, I don't know. I mean, he's on live TV and this is what the topic was. I'm out here in Oshkosh. You might hear jets in the background, but you know, I've been talking to pilots all week and they don't know how to report. They're hesitant to report because they don't trust the FAA or they don't trust the airlines and the industry to treat them fairly yet. All day long, every few minutes, I've got some very credible career pilot coming to me and telling me some amazing stories. So this is the good data. This is the data they need, but it's not getting collected. And this was a big part of the hearings the other day. Of course, Graves and Fravor brought it up, but so did many of the committee members. What's up with that? You know, where is the Air Force? Why is the FAA dismissive? Do you see them? Obviously, there's pushback. Do you see them being forced into actually taking some action to correct these problems?
Well, I mean, a couple thoughts. I mean, you mentioned the lack of reporting, the lack of a systematic approach to actually gathering the data. Part of that problem is the stigma, which still exists. Pilots don't want to report things, whether it's military pilots or commercial pilots. Often they don't want to report things for fear of being labeled a kook. As far as, you know, the government agencies, you mentioned the FAA, you mentioned the Air Force, like why do they seemingly not have a better process? I mean, I think there's a couple ways to look at that. I mean, one, most of these agencies carry out things that they were authorized to do by law by Congress. That's really what they do. Or directed by the president, the commander in chief in the case of the Air Force. Or even the FAA, the president, you know, could write an executive order saying the FAA has to do A, B, C, and D. But without a sense of urgency to do it, without real pressure, grassroots pressure from the people, pressure from members of Congress, more pressure from pilots. I mean, there's no incentive to do it. It's more work, you know, and I think if you combine the stigma with sort of, well, that's not my job. I'm not told to do that. I don't have a directive, you know, number 17-55 that tells me to do this, to set up this system, then I'm not going to do it because I got 1,000 other things to do. And oh, by the way, it's that UFO issue that nobody wants to sort of talk about or deal with anyway. Or it's so secret that you figure, oh, there must be somebody else in the government who's in charge of this. And that's the other thing that I've come to believe on some level, which is I do think there's a lot of secret government agencies who assume that somebody else is in charge of the issue of UFOs. Whereas maybe that was true back in the day, but I think over the years, maybe it's so ebbed as an issue that it's kind of one of those things that everybody assumes that somebody's on top of it, but nobody's on top of it because it's, you know, again, they weren't authorized to do it, you know, and, you know, bureaucrats are bureaucrats. I mean, at base, they only do what they're told to do. They're given funding to do. They're giving legislative guidance to do. It's, you know, they got to be able to cite the statute in the law that says I got to do this. Otherwise, you know, somebody else maybe will do it, but, you know, I don't have time for it. But just real quick to get back to the hearing this week, one of the ways, I mean, really the primary way that I'm staying involved in this issue, because, you know, whether I like to admit it or not, reluctantly or not, I got sucked into this rabbit hole and I've decided that I can't get out, so I might as well try and be useful. Now that I'm not a sort of daily journalist, I am an advisor or on the advisory board of Americans for Safe Aerospace, which of course is the pilot-led organization, you know, founded by Ryan Graves. David Fravor is a member, a bunch of other military and commercial pilots. I really do believe the way to move the ball, and I think that committee really gave voice to this past week, is to write those laws, write those regulations, force the FAA, the military, whoever, the Civil Air Patrol, the drone manufacturers, the Pilots Association of America, the airlines, figure out a construct where, just like if there was a near miss on a runway when you're coming into Chicago O'Hare, you have to file 30 pages of reports. Maybe not a 30-page UAP report, but there should be a common form that you have to fill out. It's your job because it is a safety issue potentially. And there's going to be pushback on that, because if there's advanced drones that the US has developed and we're testing, and once in a while they pop into the field of view of a commercial airline, the Air Force is going to be uncomfortable about that. And so that, it's easier said than done, but I think treating it as an air safety issue, looking for ways that you can build a real reporting system, a database that's vetted, and as much as possible can be shared publicly. A lot of what the FAA, gathers is reported publicly, eventually. I think that's one way forward, where, the other alternative is to sit and pray and hope that someday the CIA and the NRO and everybody else is going to tell us what they know. I mean, we'll all be long dead before that happens. I mean, I just don't see, if they really have the family jewels somewhere. And again, I'm a skeptic that they do. I think they might have a couple of pieces of jewels, maybe, and they haven't really put them together yet, or they're still trying to figure it out. But if we're waiting for that, if we're waiting for some disclosure, I think we'll be disappointed, because either there ain't that much to disclose, or it's so buried that it's never going to see the light of day. Congress would even be lucky to see it. But if we collect more data, make it public, push it out in a real, sensible, scientific way, maybe we can find some answers and bypass all those secret agencies and say, whatever, we don't trust you anyway. You've never been straight with us. Like, why do we need them? I mean, they probably have the best data now, but that doesn't always have to be the case. And I think that's Ryan Graves' point of view, where we collectively can push for change.
Right. I think that's kind of our point of view and a lot of people's point of view. So now we really sparked a lot of questions. So let's start up here. Here's the first question. What is the likelihood that the Senate UAP Disclosure Act of 2023 amendment will pass? And if so, what is the probability that the UAP Records Review Board described in it will have any real power?
The great question. I mean, I was glad to see that proposal, particularly by Senator Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate. He can get things done. I think the proof is in the pudding. It's kind of a lame answer, but I think it all depends on what this commission looks like, the authorities that it has. Subpoena power is crucial. But as I said earlier in my sort of intro, I think we have to face the real prospect that the people that have been empowered to find the answers and share them with Congress may not have access to all the answers. And that's a very troublesome question for everyone involved. For us on the outside, it's troublesome because you basically are acknowledging that there's a government within a government in a democracy. There is subsets of our intelligence community that basically can operate in a rogue fashion, not have to report what they're doing to the people's oversight committees, and play hide and seek with, in this case, Arrow. And I think the commission could run into a lot of the same problems. They're only going to be as effective in terms of how much these agencies actually are forced to gather and cough up what they know or what they might have known at some point in time. And that's going to be difficult because in some cases, these agencies might not even know what they once knew. I mean, that's possible too. This idea that there's just this easy chain of custody that, a guy retires and hands it to the next girl who's got the portfolio, who hands it to the next person. I mean, I think we watch too many Hollywood movies. The government is about as feckless as we are in a lot of cases, including the intelligence community. So there's a lot there, but I think the commission is a good step. It's an important step. I think I'd like to see people put on that commission who are not just career intel people and, career politicians, because I don't think we'll have a ton of faith in that. I want some bomb throwers on that commission. Would be nice to see a Ryan Graves on there, one of the pilots, or somebody from SCU, a scientist who, is not necessarily a career government type. And then the last thing I'll say about the commission, it's kind of modeled, supposedly, or will be modeled on the JFK Records Act, which was a commission that was set up in 1992 to force intel agencies to cough up what they might know related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And I think that effort was successful to a point, but the problem is that commission had no forcing mechanism. These agencies could still go to the president and make the argument that we have all these files and we don't want to release them to the public. We don't want to cough them up. Give us a get out of jail free card. If this commission has that same setup, then in the end, I don't think it'll get us much transparency, because the CIA or the Air Force or somebody could go to whoever's the president at the time and say, for national security reasons, we can't share this. And there may be a valid reason for that, but there was no requirement in the JFK Records Act for them to explain to the public, even in a little detail, as to why they're deciding this batch of records should stay secret. And so, again, it's a long-winded answer, but I think the authorities it has, who's on it, is going to make a big difference. Otherwise, it could be a sort of exercise in a lot of activity and what looks like a lot of motion, but not necessarily a lot of coming out on the other end.
Gotcha. Somebody's got their hand raised. Do go into Whova and put your questions in the Q&A. Next question is, Ross Coulthart speculates that the mainstream media are avoiding doing true investigative journalism because journalists know they will be excluded from national security information on other stories if they dig into the issue. Now, I would say that, you certainly are educated as you're proving on this issue and were when you wrote articles, but they're asking, do you agree, or do you have a different explanation for the lack of mainstream coverage following the recent hearing, with News Nation being the main exception?
Well, I don't know. I read a pretty good story today on NPR's website, National Public Radio, had a very straightforward recounting of the hearing, including, the headline had biologics in it. So, I don't know that I would agree that the mainstream media is just ignoring this, or, there are particular outlets, particular reporters who have an interest in it, who've covered it. I would agree with Ross, though, in the sense that there is still, because I still hear it from a lot of my former colleagues, there's still a reluctance, sort of, I think, a professional resistance among a lot of reporters to go there, that they feel like it's on some level risky, that you'll somehow lose access or you'll be ridiculed. I also think there really is also a sense that, we reporters, at least reporters that came up in my day, it's the who, what, when, where, how, right? Like, you want to be able to gather information and gather facts and make some sort of conclusion, or at least quote credible people who make some conclusions. This is a very difficult subject to do that. And so I think there's also this human nature to not go there, because you don't see what the end game is, right? It's a lot of claims. It's a lot of, also, quite frankly, a lot of not credible people in this space. And it was very difficult for me. I relied on you, Alejandro, to help me figure out in the beginning a little bit, like, is this person a kook, or is this person credible? Like, should I interview them? Should I not? I think that's a disincentive for some mainstream reporters, who are also, by the way, very busy. In case you haven't noticed, if you're a national security reporter, there's a war in Ukraine. the world is kind of melting down before our eyes. It's not like there's nothing else to cover. But again, I think all those factors play into what Ross is saying, which is there is a resistance. And I think some of it is not wanting to be ridiculed, not wanting to burn sources. It's a very difficult subject to get your head around. And oh, by the way, yes, we have these great claims, and it's easy to write a story that somebody claimed something, but that doesn't really move the ball very often, right? I mean, until you really know, is there information to back it up? What is Congress going to do about it? What does the Pentagon say? But there are reporters out there in the so-called mainstream press that are covering it. Some are skeptical, maybe overly skeptical in their coverage, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I don't know that we'd want the opposite, where we want a bunch of reporters saying, rah, rah, give us the aliens, because we don't have proof of that. At least proof that a lot of us think we would need to objectively say, yes, this is the case. I think in my case, and maybe I'm unique in some sense, is I didn't really care about the repercussions of covering this story because, number one, it was a scoop, or at least I thought it was a scoop at the time until I saw it on the New York Times front page the same day. But, and it was a political story. I mean, it was about a Senator, Harry Reid, who secretly put money in the budget to study UFOs. I mean, there was an element to it that was a very Washington story that happened to be about UFOs. And so at first, I don't think I really was that worried about it. And then I think over time, I had the benefit of having covered the Pentagon for 20 plus years before that story. So, for good or bad, I had a decent reputation there as a decently credible reporter. So I wasn't worried that people were never going to talk to me again. In fact, it was sort of interesting. A lot of people who weren't that talkative or were really difficult to get to talk were reaching out to me because they were like, hey, tell me about that story you wrote. This is really fascinating. I was surprised at how many people on the inside who didn't necessarily know anything about UFOs because of their jobs felt like, oh, they could now kibitz about it and talk about it because wow, it's on the cover of the newspaper. What do you think's really going on, Bender? So anyway, again, a long-winded answer, but the story's not going away. So whether it's News Nation or Debrief or, some major media outlets who, kind of pop in and pop out. But it is interesting. I think it would be hard for a major newspaper or broadcast outlet to justify a major investigative effort on this topic. It's not inconceivable, but somebody would really, really have to sell it and make the case to senior editors that we're really going to find something new here. Because, I was at the Boston Globe. I used to contribute to some of the investigative projects, also at Politico. A lot of times, newsrooms put resources into something like that when they have some decent level of confidence that even though we don't know what we're going to find out, we're pretty sure we can uncover some steamy shit here. And if you can't go in thinking that or having confidence of that, it's hard to sell it because you're dedicating reporters for months at a time, potentially money, resources, travel. A lot of these outlets don't have a ton of money to do that. So they're going to pick their targets. But at some point, if more drips out, and like I said at the outset, I don't think we've learned a whole lot more. We've heard a lot of claims, much of it are claims that have been made for decades. What we need is to see some real information.
Yeah, just a real quick follow-up on that, I guess, is that I've attempted to be as dispassionate about as possible in writing about this topic. And I think you have been as well, which is kind of also the scientific approach. And despite you being an advisor for Ryan Graves' air safety group, you're obviously dispassionate about it now. But there still is that tongue-in-cheek by a lot of the mainstream. It's kind of going away, but that they seem to feel like they can come with a very hard perspective. Even the New York Times, I think you even tweeted a little criticism of Barnes being a bit biased there, coming in, with a hard either making fun of the whole thing or being very dismissive and not being as dispassionate as they would be about any other topic.
Yeah, I mean, I know Julian for years. I think he's a solid reporter. Uh, he's covered the intelligence community better than virtually anybody else, and he's thrown some punches. I mean, it's not like he's, these claims that, oh, Barnes must be on the payroll. I mean, it's bunk. It's all bunk. Nobody who says that knows anything about how the media works. I mean, there's always this sort of subtle pressure to not piss off the powers that be if you want access and you want to be called over to Langley for the background briefing on the new report that they're going to put out. But I feel like, I mean, I'll say it and Julian will, probably blast me about it. But I think the Times, with the exception of maybe the first couple articles on this topic back in 2017, and then I think there was another one in 2019, they've been overly skeptical. I mean, almost dismissive in their coverage. And I just think there's a way they can be a little bit more objective. I'm not saying that, they should drink the Kool-Aid and believe what all these whistleblowers are saying. And, but, a little bit more skepticism would be nice, particularly this notion that Arrow might not have the whole truth. And just because Arrow says it doesn't make it the full truth, because that's just not how the national security bureaucracy works. I mean, and Julian knows that. I think he knows that. But, everybody's got a bias. Everybody's got a bias. You just got to be aware of what your biases are so that you minimize them in your reporting. I mean, we're all humans. We all come from where we come from. We're all shaped by what we're shaped by. And the notion that we're all unbiased is just, that's bunk too. You have to be aware of your biases and try to, keep them out of your story. And I just thought some of the recent coverage was just overly submissive of the big claims. I think there's a way you could say these are big claims. They're not corroborated, but there's a lot of serious people who are taking them seriously, including the Congress.
Right. Next question. Have you taken into account that Arrow may not have the proper classification to investigate Grush's claims? I think you've already said that, actually. After all, he testified under oath. Would he do this without danger of legal reprisals?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not 100% sure I know the answer to that. I mean, I know there's this debate over Title 10 versus, is it Title something else, 25. Different authorities in terms of who can be read in to what secret, buried programs. I'm not an expert on what authorities Arrow has or doesn't have. But I mean, my experience tells me that even if they have all the authority to see something, again, you still have to have that agency provide it. I mean, they still have to give it to you. If you don't know that it exists, and they know that you don't know it exists, it's irrelevant what your authorities are. I mean, so I think it's a question that Congress is looking at. Some of these oversight committees are looking at, do they have the right authorities? I believe some of the legislation that's working its way through this year is also going to address that, because I think it's a real potential hurdle here, which is if Arrow is supposed to be the final arbiter of this stuff to the Congress or to the public or a combination of both, do they really have the sort of the power, the heft, the ability to gather up what's really there? And I think it's a big open question. And I think Congress gets that. I mean, I think some of these lawmakers that have taken a real interest in this understand that this effort is ultimately about sort of ripping up some cobwebs, if you will, within the national security bureaucracy, if you're really going to get at the truth or the fuller picture of what the truth might be.
Next question. If Grush and hundreds of witnesses and whistleblowers for decades are true, what do you think it would take for the globe to finally digest it? The president addressing the world, someone else?
Yeah, this question comes up a lot, and I guess I'm not a philosopher. Um, I'm not even a political scientist. I mean, I usually respond to this question with a question, which is, if the big announcement is coming or the big revelation is coming, write for me the first two sentences of that press release. What does it say? And when I ask that question, I almost always get a different answer. And so, like, what are we revealing? What is the president announcing? That we had a secret UFO retrieval program, that we know that aliens exist, on some other planet. I mean, to me, as a journalist, a trained journalist, and now a Beltway bandit, it's just beyond the realm of where I can feel like confidently I can give a good answer. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, I think it would all depend on how it plays out, how it comes out, how it's learned. I've sort of half jokingly said a few times, I think disclosure will come if there are intelligent beings not of human origin that are here or were here or visit here, when they decide it's time for a full global disclosure. Because it seems to me if they're here and they exist, they could do that. And they haven't. Doesn't mean that the people who have had their own experiences and are 100% convinced they are here aren't telling the truth or don't really believe what they're saying. Of course they do. But I've always wondered in my own head, like, if they really want this sort of unquestionable, we're here, they could do that, right? If you think they're here or you think they exist. So, I don't know. I mean, I think if there's disclosure, I tend to think that something that big, that human history changing, our president, our international leaders will be reacting. They won't be proactive about it. It's not going to be, let's finally reveal, what we've known for 75 years. But, I could be wrong. I really could be wrong.
So, Julian Barnes has kind of taken this angle. We did hear from Gallagher kind of months ago, kind of express the same idea that what the Congress is trying to do is their due diligence. So if they take the public, belief that, let's say, Roswell's real and the bodies are out there, that they've got to do everything they can to try to suss out and get that information, despite not expecting to find something that may be, how much, of that kind of sentiment are you hearing or you believe there to be, that maybe that's how this started and now they've kind of accidentally opened up this Pandora's box, or do you think they really genuinely think, hey, there might be something here? Of course, we're hearing a lot, but it's hard to take rhetoric from politicians necessarily completely seriously.
No, but they're human beings too. And, some of them, I think, come at this issue innately curious, just like we are. Could this be true? I mean, what is the real story? When I did the first interview with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand a couple of years ago, when she started to sort of take a leading role in this, one of the first things she told me was, when I got elected to the Senate, my two sons were like, Mom, you're on the Intelligence Committee. Go find out where the aliens are. And so, you can imagine she's a mom sitting around the table at home. It comes up. So she's like, yeah, I'm on the Intelligence Committee. I could find that out, maybe. So why not? So I think on some level, whether it's her or Mike Gallagher or others, I think there is some level of that where they're just innately curious. And then I think there's the more public and probably logical approach, which is we have some credible people, more than some, many, making these claims or sharing their testimony of what they think they saw or experienced. I'm entrusted with the country's national security because I'm on these key oversight committees that oversee the defense budget or the intelligence agencies. We should probably find out what these things are. And I remember talking to Mike Gallagher about it. I think it was after that first public hearing a little more than a year ago, where, some pretty provocative things were raised in that hearing. The Malmstrom Air Force Base case in 1967, 8, where there were some credible reports of some sort of orbs hovering over these missile bases and potentially shutting off the nukes. His point of view was there's these big claims out there and they're kind of right in the middle of the conversation. If we are going to get to the truth, if nothing else, we have to get these things off the table. And so if that really isn't something that, we think happened, or we think there could be some more rational explanations for it, the intelligence business is mostly about a process of elimination. You don't just get spies and send them out and say, go find out what's going on. It's often finding out what's not going on and narrowing down the possibilities until you get to what you think might really be going on. And so that's what Mike Gallagher was trying to explain. I mean, some of these more fantastical claims, we can't ignore them. We have to go after them because, what if they are true? They're a pretty big deal. But if they're not, they're sort of crowding out, they're providing so much noise that we're not really going to get to what I think a lot of these members of Congress think is really the main job, which is there's stuff in our airspace. We don't know what it is. The Pentagon claims some of them are not ours, and they seem to exhibit, aerodynamic properties that we can't explain. We better find out what they are, because if they're not ours, whose are they? And so, but again, you can't discount that these are human beings. I mean, I'm 51 years old. I feel like I'm still young. A lot of these members of Congress are younger than I am. And so, they're more open-minded, they're more curious. They've seen a million sci-fi movies just like the rest of us. And now they find themselves sitting on a committee where, oh my God, I can go badger the generals to tell me what's going on. I think that's driving some of it. Not all of it, some of it.
I want to fit in a couple questions, but we only have a couple minutes left. Yeah. First question. In the history of journalism, how many whistleblowers have there been that gave testimony to Congress and then we found out they were incorrect or lying?
Don't know, but probably not many.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
I know you're a student of history, so
not many that were sane. And I mean, because the repercussions are pretty dire. I mean, lying to Congress is not something to be trifled with. I mean, I talked to David Grush about more than a year ago, first interacted with him. And I always thought he was very credible. He seemed on the up and up. I mean, I don't know him personally, so, I can't say for sure, but he got all the clearances and his clearances were re-upped and he was given, higher jobs and, more responsibility. So, I think he's the real deal. I think he believes what he's saying. I don't think he's lying. But, as you know, and a lot of people in this room know, people sometimes get obsessed with this topic and they believe things, or they're prone to be convinced of things that have a weird way of getting further and further and further away from the actual thing. And I'm open-minded about his testimony. I think his testimony was very convincing the other day. I think he answered the questions very good.
One last question.
Galactic game of telephone. It's not impossible.
How strange is Kirkpatrick's response that he responded, after to a congressional witness? That seems pretty unusual.
It's unusual for sure. I mean, I don't remember a lot of cases of that, but at the same time, I mean, if there's something that sort of takes on a life of its own in the public discourse, it's not unheard of that the Pentagon would put out a statement and try to correct the record, or,
But he didn't even do it through the through press through Susan Goff. He kind of
No, he did it on his
LinkedIn.
own, which is rare. But I'm not that surprised because I mean, let's face it, the bad guys and gals in that hearing room this past Wednesday was the Pentagon and the national security bureaucracy. They're lying to us. It's a cover up. They won't tell us the truth. They can't even, they won't even give us a clean audit of their budget. I mean, they're all a bunch of thieves, basically. That was one of the narratives of that committee's, hearing. And so if you're Kirkpatrick, I mean, you have people that work for you that are dedicated public servants that I think are genuinely, in most cases, probably trying to get some level of truth, trying to answer the mail, to get Congress some answers because they've written a law demanding it. And I think he probably felt like he needed to defend his people. And, I sort of give him credit for that. It's like, listen, you may not like it that we can't tell you everything and we don't have all the answers yet. And we're working on it and we're learning and we're building up and all of that they constantly keep saying. It's been years now and they're still building and they're still hiring and they're still getting their systems in place. At some point, they have to get their shit together. I mean, but at the same time, I think he wanted to defend his people and say, listen, we're working hard. We're doing the best we can. Give us the benefit of the doubt. But the longer that goes on, the harder it is to give them the benefit of the doubt. And them being not just Arrow, but the executive branch writ large.
Right. Well, thank you very much. There are a lot of questions in the chat and the QA area. If you wouldn't mind, if you got some time to go in there and maybe answer a few of those, that would be very helpful. We'd be very grateful. Thank you for joining us today and sharing this information.
Thanks for having me. I don't know if I see questions in the chat, but maybe offline we can make sure I see those.
Yeah, maybe someone can help Brian out with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.